Hello, and welcome to another quiet, comforting episode of The Sleepy Local Historian. Tonight, you're not just listening, you're stepping into a warm wooden cabin, tucked away in the countryside, where the fire crackles softly in the hearth and gentle rain taps against the window panes. Everything here invites rest. If you found your way to this place, perhaps you're looking for something slow and soothing to fall asleep to. A story told gently, a voice that drifts like smoke. This evening, we'll be wandering through the deep and timeless history of London. Not the London of bright lights and busy streets, but the older one of Roman ruins and Saxon settlements, of winding medieval lanes and the quiet flow of the Thames. Before we begin, if this kind of storytelling helps you relax, I'd love for you to subscribe so you'll always know when a new sleepy journey awaits. And please let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? For now, simply settle in. Let the sounds of the fire and rain hold you. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. And as the cabin grows quiet and the past draws near, we'll begin a gentle journey into the story of London, where every stone remembers and the river always moves. Long before London had a name, before walls were built or bridges crossed the river, before kings ruled and markets bustled, there was land and there was water and there was sky, and in that gentle, shifting place, a river moved, the Thames. Wide and slow, flowed through a landscape of forests and marshes, meadows and reeds, its surface broken by the passing of otters and birds, its banks soft with mud and roots. It was not yet the river of empire and commerce, of battles and coronations. It was simply the river, timeless and tireless, rising and falling with the tide, shaping the land with every bend. Along its banks, animals came to drink red, deer, wild boar, aurochs, and above it, long before anyone thought to call this England, birds wheeled in great swirling flocks. The land was rich and quiet, warmed by mild air and watered by frequent rains, and the first humans to live here did so as part of the land itself, moving with the seasons, gathering berries and herbs, fishing with sharpened bone, carving paths through the underbrush. In time, they built shelters, lit fires, and left behind fragments, tools, arrowheads, the remains of meals, small traces of life that would lie hidden for millennia beneath what would one day become streets. And bricks. Thousands of years before London, there were settlements on higher ground, close to the river but safe from its floods. People built with what they had, wood, hide, grass, and lived not in cities, but in small, scattered groups, tending fires and telling stories beneath the stars. They watched the seasons turn, marked time by the moon, buried their dead in mounds, and left rings of stone in sacred places. As the centuries passed, these early inhabitants of the Thames Valley began to shape their world more deliberately. They cleared patches of forest for grazing. They learned to grow barley and wheat. They domesticated animals. The land became layered with memory, each generation walking the same trails, drawing water from the same stream. The river became more than a source of food. It was a road, a boundary, a blessing. Its currents carried people and goods, ideas and stories. Wooden boats began to appear, carved from single trunks, guided by poles and paddles. The first signs of trade emerged, flint from one region, pottery from another. As the Bronze Age dawned, the people of the Thames built more complex settlements. They cast tools and ornaments, planted in rows, and shaped the earth into defensive banks and ditches. They began to understand wealth, not just in food or fire, but in objects and alliances. The river, always at the heart of this world, served as a highway and a mirror, its surface reflecting the sky and the smoke of distant hearths. Offerings were made to it, swords, jewelry, sometimes even the bodies of the dead, placed carefully. Into the water, gifts to whatever spirit or force watched from beneath the surface. And so, long before the rise of cities, the Thames was sacred. It held within it the breath of a people who asked it for life and feared its silence. In the Iron Age, hill forts began to rise on the heights around the river, not cities, but gathering places, refuges in times of danger, seats of local power. Trade grew, so did population. Across the region, tribes flourished, the Trinovantes, the Catuvillani, their names only guessed at from scattered Roman texts and archaeological finds. They farmed, they fought, they feasted. They minted coins, war cloaks dyed with woad, and traced their ancestry through spoken lineages passed down by firelight. The land was not empty. It was full of life, of memory, of meaning. And then, sometime in the middle of the 1st century BCE, strangers came, first as traders, then as conquerors. The Romans, expanding across Europe, turned their eyes toward the island they called Britannia. In 55 BCE, Julius Caesar crossed the Channel and made contact, brief and theatrical, but the beginning of something deeper. It would take nearly a century before the Romans returned in force. In 43 CE, under Emperor Claudius, they invaded. In earnest, bringing legions, roads, forts, and empire. The world of the Thames was about to change forever. The Roman army pushed across the island, and near a narrow crossing of the Thames, where the banks sloped gently and the tides allowed ships to pass, they built a bridge, or perhaps a ford, and beside it a new settlement, Londinium. It was not large at first, just a military outpost and a trading post, a place of timber warehouses and orderly camps. But it grew. The location was too perfect, too strategic, too central to remain small. Within decades, Londinium became a town of paved streets and tiled roofs, of temples and bathhouses, of Latin inscriptions and Roman law. A wall was built, aqueducts brought water, markets bustled with goods from across the empire, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, glass from the Rhineland. And yet, beneath it all, the river remained. The Thames, older than every wall and coin, still moved at its pace, rising and falling, carrying silt and history. Even as Londinium grew into a provincial capital with thousands of residents and a grand basilica, the city still depended on the river. Docks lined its banks, ships came and went, fish were caught and sold. Floods still came, and the people of the city watched the tides with both reverence and worry. And then, sometime in the early 5th century, it ended. The Roman legions withdrew. The roads cracked. The bathhouses grew cold. Londinium, once a proud outpost of empire, faded. The walls remained, but within them, silence returned. Grass grew in the streets. The river whispered once more. For a time, the story of the Thames seemed to slow, but it did not end, because always, people returned to the river. They followed the curve of its banks. They built shelters. They lit fires. They watched the herons and listened for the bells of the future. And in that space between empires, before the Saxons arrived, before London was London, there was the land and the river and the sky. And the river moved. By the end of the Roman era and the beginning of the 5th century, the bustling settlement of Londinium had grown quiet, its stone walls still standing, but its streets largely empty, overgrown with weeds and shadow, the great baths silent, the temples closed, the forums abandoned to the wind and the rain. For nearly 4 centuries, the Romans had ruled this place with roads and laws, markets and mosaics, but when they withdrew their legions in the early 400s, they left behind more than buildings. They left a space, a silence, into which a new story would slowly grow. In the centuries that followed, Saxon settlers arrived from across the sea, from what is now Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands, bringing with them a new language, new customs, and a new way of life. They did not settle immediately within the old Roman city. Instead, they built their communities a little to the west, on higher, drier ground, closer to what would become the Strand in Westminster. The Saxon town, often called Londonwick, was a place of timber and thatch, not stone and marble, a village of merchants and farmers nestled by the bend of the Thames, where ships could be pulled up onto the gravel banks and markets set out along the shore. It was not a grand city, not yet, but it was steady, a place where fish were dried, wool was spun, and prayers were said in small wooden churches. The river remained the lifeblood of London, as it had always been, and boats still passed daily, carrying barrels and baskets, gossip and grain, from settlement to settlement along its winding course. Life was quieter now, and slower, more local, but no less vital. People rose with the sun, tended to sheep and hearths, drew water from wells, and carved runes into wood and stone. In the early years, there were few large buildings, no theaters, no aqueducts, but there was rhythm and order. Kings ruled small kingdoms, sometimes warring, sometimes allied, their courts gathering in mead halls lit by firelight, their warriors loyal, their power grounded in land and kin. In the 7th century, Christianity returned to London with greater force. Missionaries from Rome and from Celtic lands brought crosses, Latin scripture, and the idea of a single God. Churches were built, small at first, humble and wooden, then slowly larger, more enduring, and in 604, a new cathedral was founded in the Roman city, still largely abandoned, dedicated to St. Paul. It was the beginning of something lasting. Though much of old Londinium remained a shell, the presence of the church brought people back within the walls. Over time, Londonwick and the Roman city, now called Londonburg, began to coexist. Trade resumed, coins were minted, kings were crowned, the riverfront bustled again with life. But this was no golden age. The Saxon city was vulnerable, always watching the horizon, always fearing sails that might appear where the sky met the sea. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, those fears became real. Viking raids struck London more than once. Norse warriors sailed up the Thames, burned homes, looted churches, and vanished again into the fog. In 842, a particularly brutal attack devastated the town. The response, under King Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, was both practical and visionary. He fortified the city, re-establishing the main settlement inside the old Roman walls, which he repaired and strengthened. The city now had both physical protection and royal attention. Streets were laid out, a system of governance returned. Trade flourished. London became not just a place to live, but a place to lead. By the turn of the first millennium, it had grown into one of the most important cities in England, rivaling even Winchester, the traditional seat of Saxon kings. The Thames remained central to its life, its waters bringing goods and messages, its tides still rising and falling as they had under the Romans. But the people had changed. Their speech was now Old English. Their rulers wore cloaks of wool, not togas. Their stories were told in sagas and sermons. Markets were held weekly, drawing merchants from across the land, offering salted fish, iron tools, pots, herbs, woven cloth. The great cathedral of St. Paul's, though modest by later standards, was the spiritual heart of the city. Monks copied texts in candlelit rooms. Bishops advised kings. A sense of permanence was beginning to settle in, like mist on the river, and yet violence was never far. London changed hands more than once, sometimes ruled by English kings, sometimes by Danish conquerors. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard captured London. His son, Canute the Great, would later rule England from the city, integrating Danish and Saxon traditions, laws, and titles. The city, always watchful, adapted. It bent but did not break. Its people learned to live with uncertainty, to rebuild what was burned, to replant what was trampled. And still they prayed, still they worked, still they listened for the bells from the churches that now dotted the landscape. By the middle of the 11th century, London was well on its way to becoming the political and economic capital of England. The population had grown, slowly but steadily. Streets were named. Taxes were collected. A port had formed along the riverbank, busy with ships unloading wine, wool, and grain. Houses were still mostly timber, but some were now faced with stone. The city had inns, stables, blacksmiths, and brewers. It had watchmen and judges, merchants, and messengers. And though it lacked the pomp and monumentality of Rome, it had something deeper: continuity. A thread that tied the Roman past to the Saxon present, and soon to something new. In 1042, Edward the Confessor became king. A quiet, deeply religious man, he built a great abbey west of the city, Westminster, which would later become the traditional site of royal coronations. He preferred to rule from there rather than from the old Roman city. But London remained the heart of trade, the meeting place of merchants and monarchs alike. When Edward died in 1066, it was in London that Harold Godwinson was crowned king. And when William of Normandy invaded that same year and defeated Harold at Hastings, it was London that resisted him, refusing to yield immediately. William responded with fire, burning villages around the city. But eventually, London opened its gates. William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, and with that, the Saxon era ended and the Norman age began. But the city remained. It had survived raids and revolts, kings and conquerors. It had grown from ruins into rhythms, from timber huts into markets and cathedrals. Its people had woven together Roman stone and Saxon wood, Latin prayers and English songs, fear and faith. They had walked the same paths as their ancestors, drawn water from the same river, heard the same winds and the same trees. And though the names had changed and the rulers had shifted, London was still London, quiet, steady, enduring. Always close to the river, always watching the horizon, always ready for what came next. By the year 1100, London had become more than just a Roman outpost or a Saxon town. It had become a medieval city, shaped by conquest, crowned with churches, wrapped in walls, and humming with the slow rhythm of daily life, of worship and trade, of noise and stillness, of cold winters and candlelit nights. After the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror sought to secure his new kingdom, and so he built a stone fortress on the northern bank of the Thames, the White Tower, which would later become the heart of the Tower of London. Not just a military outpost, but a treasury, a prison, a palace, and a warning in stone, casting its long shadow over the city for centuries to come. Around it, the streets of London twisted and turned in narrow, uneven lanes, lined with timber-framed houses that leaned inward over muddy walkways, their upper stories nearly touching across the alleys. The city smelled of animals and bread, smoke and sweat, tallow and wet wool. Life was hard but steady. Most Londoners lived in small, smoky homes warmed by open fires, lit by the soft flicker of rushlights or candles made from animal fat, their ceilings low and their walls drafty. Streets were filled with animals, pigs rooting through waste, chickens flapping in doorways, and horses pulling carts across cobbles, thick with mud and worse. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Waste was thrown into open gutters. Rain helped, so did frost. In winter, the Thames sometimes froze solid enough to walk across, and in rare festive years, Londoners would hold frost fairs on the ice setting. Up booths for roasted chestnuts and ale, games and music, all built upon the frozen river itself, the city turning its coldest hardship into a kind of celebration. But winters were not always so kind. The cold could kill, so could hunger or fire or disease. Plague would come again and again, long before the Black Death of 1348, and illness was a quiet, constant presence in medieval life. Children often did not survive past infancy. Women died in childbirth. The sick prayed for saints to intervene, and yet the city continued. Faith shaped every aspect of medieval London. Church bells rang the hours, and the calendar was marked not by months, but by feast days and fasts. Candlemas, Easter, All Saints, Christmas. People gave alms, lit candles, crossed themselves when passing a shrine. Monasteries cared for the poor and the sick, offering bread, beds, and burial. Priories and convents dotted the city, places of prayer and silence, of ink and script. Latin was spoken in the Mass, even if most Londoners did not understand it. St. Paul's Cathedral, then a great Romanesque church with a tall wooden spire, not yet the dome we know today, dominated the skyline, its bells audible for miles. Pilgrims passed through the city on their way to Canterbury, stopping at churches and chapels, leaving coins and prayers. Inside parish churches, wooden pews and stone fonts were smoothed from generations of hands. The city was full of guilds, each representing a trade or craft: brewers, coopers, weavers, carpenters, butchers, bakers, goldsmiths, each with their own rules, their own patron saints, their own halls. Apprentices lived with their masters, learning a trade from boyhood, serving for years before earning the right to call themselves a freeman. These guilds not only shaped the economy, but also the festivals and pageants of the city. On feast days, banners flew, processions marched, plays were performed in churchyards or on wooden carts. May Day brought greenery and songs. Midsummer brought bonfires. At Christmas time, the Lord of Misrule might be elected, a peasant made king for a day, inverting the world in jest and cheer. Markets took place regularly, filled with shouting and barter with salted fish, wheels of cheese, jugs of ale, rolls of cloth, wax, honey, and spiced gingerbread. London Bridge, still made of wood in the early centuries, groaned beneath the weight of carts and hoofbeats. Later rebuilt in stone, it held houses, shops, even a chapel, a street above the river, alive with life. Boats ferried passengers and goods from one side of the Thames to the other, navigating tides and mists. The river was vital for water, for travel, for trade, and sometimes for punishment. Executed heads were mounted on spikes above the bridge, a grim warning to all who passed. Justice was both theatrical and public. Thieves could be hanged. Heretics burned. Stocks stood in public squares. But mercy was also part of life. People gave pennies to the poor. They shared bread with the sick. The rhythm of life was slow, repetitive, and sacred. Time was marked not by clocks, but by bells. Meals were simple: pottage, bread, ale, and most people rarely traveled beyond a few miles from home. Yet London was also a place of movement. Traders came from the Low Countries and France. Visitors brought silks and spices. News spread by word of mouth, by sermon, by scroll. Literacy was rare but growing. Scribes worked in candlelight, copying books in Latin, painting saints in gold leaf. And when the Black Death arrived in 1348, it came like a silence, sudden, choking, unstoppable. It killed as many as half the population. Entire parishes were emptied. Priests died anointing the sick. Streets fell quiet. Burial pits filled. Yet again, London endured. Survivors rebuilt, replanted, remarried. Life returned, cautiously. Wages rose. The population slowly recovered. But something had changed. Something in the way the city saw itself. Its fragility. Its dependence on the divine. And even as time moved forward, dangers remained. Fire was a constant threat. In 1212, a blaze on London Bridge killed hundreds. Wooden houses burned quickly, especially in dry summers, when sparks from a hearth could ignite an entire street. Without a formal fire brigade, people formed lines with buckets, using river water to fight the flames. And always, always, the rebuilding began again. The city was used to starting over. Political unrest came too. Kings clashed with barons, peasants revolted. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, rebels entered the city. They burned buildings. They stormed the tower. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. But the uprising collapsed. Order returned. Life continued. By the year 1500, London had changed, but it was still recognizably medieval. Its walls still stood. Its gates still closed at night. Its streets were still crooked and crowded, its skyline still full of steeples and smoke. The printing press had arrived, quietly beginning a revolution. But most people still lived as their grandparents had, rising with the sun, kneeling in church, working with their hands, and going to bed when the candles ran low. The city was dark and damp and dangerous, but it was alive, with voices, with bells, with the smell of bread and the crackle of fire, with the slow churn of carts and the flutter of prayer flags. It was a place of hardship and holiness, of markets and mystery, and always, always the river moved. The bells of old London still rang each morning, still called bakers to their ovens, boys to their chores, and women to market, and yet, by the year 1500, the city they rang over was changing. Quietly, steadily, Tudor London was emerging. The old medieval lanes still twisted and turned, narrow and crowded, lined with tall timber houses, and the Thames still flowed as it always had, though now its banks were growing busier, fuller, louder. London was still a place of markets and guilds, prayers, and processions, but new voices echoed in its streets. New thoughts stirred, and soon new power would rise. In the early 1500s, a king sat on the throne, Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, who brought a quiet stability after long years of civil war. He counted his coins carefully, married wisely, and ruled without drama. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who would change London forever. When Henry came to power in 1509, London was a city of roughly 50,000 people, not yet a giant, but already the largest city in England. Its people lived as they had for generations. They worked, married, cooked, mended, bargained, prayed, swept their doorsteps each morning, passed under low arches, leaned out from upper windows, and lit candles at dusk. But Henry was not a quiet king. He was loud, proud, and determined to shape both crown and church to his will. He built palaces, grand, sprawling homes made of brick and stone, and one of them, Whitehall Palace, became his main London residence, sitting by the Thames with grand halls, private gardens, and rooms lined with tapestries. He hosted feasts, with hundreds of guests, dancers, musicians, and roast meats carried in on silver platters. But not far from those glittering halls, Londoners still lived their small, simple lives. They fetched water, bought onions, argued over fish prices, and watched the royal barges glide down the river, even if they never rode them. Henry's greatest impact on London would not be his buildings, but his break with the Catholic Church. In 1534, he declared himself head of the Church of England, separating from the Pope, and what followed was the dissolution of the monasteries, a quiet, slow dismantling of the old religious world. London's abbeys and priories were emptied. Stone by stone, their cloisters came down, gold and silver were seized, monks were sent away, and sacred land was repurposed. Some of it became grand estates, other parts became new streets, new homes, new parishes. The skyline of London began to shift. Less spire, more chimney, less Latin chant, more English psalm. People noticed, but life for most continued as always. Bread was baked, pottage was stirred, shoes were repaired, babies were born and old. Men died, and yet things felt different. The language of church changed, the rhythms of worship shifted, and something else stirred beneath the surface, something bold and new: books. Thanks to the printing press, ideas spread faster now, and paper pages carried poems, sermons, plays, and protest. London became a place of printers. In small, smoky workshops near Fleet Street where men bent over presses, arranging letters, inking rollers, and turning paper into power. Plays were printed, pamphlets were printed, laws, hymns, heresies, and dreams. And as the century moved on, a young queen would take the throne, one who would turn London into a city of words and wonder. In 1558, Elizabeth I became queen, and her long reign would be one of theater, exploration, conflict, and a growing, glowing London. Under Elizabeth, the city began to sprawl beyond its walls. Houses climbed the hills to the north and east. Fields became alleys, gardens became lanes. Carts rattled down longer roads, and the smoke rose higher each year. The air was filled with new sounds: the tapping of hammers on ship masts, the hiss of boiling dye in cloth factories, the clinking of coins in merchant hands, and the rising, rolling laughter of theaters. This was the age of the playhouse just south of the Thames. In Southwark, wooden theaters were built, round and open-roofed, full of shouting and applause, and one of them was called the Globe. There, a man named William Shakespeare put words into the mouths of kings and fools, lovers and ghosts, and his lines floated over the crowd. To be, or not to be, all the world's a stage. Now is the winter of our discontent. But the people who heard them still carried baskets of turnips, still mended stockings by firelight, still prayed for healthy births and gentle deaths. London remained a city of two worlds, the grand and the gritty, the courtly and the common. In the court, diplomats argued over marriage treaties and foreign visitors bowed before the queen. In the streets, boys tossed apples at rats, apprentices flirted with washer girls, and men haggled over barrels of salted herring. Elizabeth's London was proud and golden, but it was also smoky, smelly, and loud. Chimneys puffed black clouds. Overcrowded roofs, horses clattered down cobbled lanes, church bells rang often, and dogs barked in reply. At night, lanterns swung from doorways, watchmen called the hours, and the Thames lapped at its banks, carrying barges toward the Tower, and back again. There were dangers too. In 1592, the plague returned, theaters closed, houses were marked with red crosses, families stayed indoors, and the city, usually so loud, fell silent. The death carts rolled through the lanes, the sick were locked away, the smell of vinegar filled the air, and churches rang funeral bells slowly and often. But once again, London endured. When the plague passed, the theaters reopened, the presses turned, the ships returned to dock, and the city moved forward, one step, one breath, one candle at a time. By 1600, London was no longer just a city. It was a symbol, a place of culture, trade, power, and poetry. Its population had grown to nearly 200,000. Ships filled the docks, markets teemed with goods from across the sea, oranges, spices, silk, silver, tobacco from the New World, stories from travelers, rumors from sailors. The streets were still uneven, the gutters still ran with rain and worse, but above it all, the bells still rang. And still, each morning, someone swept their doorstep, someone stirred porridge in a wooden bowl, someone lit a candle and opened. A book. Someone crossed London Bridge holding a child's hand. Tudor London was not always glorious, it was not always clean, but it was alive, full of song and sorrow, power and plague, ale and ink. And still always the river moved. The Thames carrying queens, dreams, paper, and time. By the year 1660, London was a city reborn, and yet still deeply old. It had survived wars and plagues, queens and kings, poets and preachers. Its streets had grown more tangled, its population larger than ever. Nearly 500,000 people now called it home, and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and cooking oil, sea salt and sweat. The city sprawled tightly along the Thames, its narrow lanes packed with houses built close together, often overhanging the streets below. The buildings were made of timber, dry and crooked, leaning toward each other as if in conversation. Many were several stories high, with jettied upper floors and signs creaking above shop doors. There were markets and alleyways, churches and coffee houses, and in between, tucked into corners, were printers' shops, stables, taverns, and bakehouses. The streets were alive with horses and carts, shouting and laughter, gossip and grime. And in the summer of 1665, something dreadful returned, the plague. It crept in quietly, from ships arriving in the ports, from rats and fleas, from the deep, dark corners of overcrowded homes. Within weeks, people began to fall ill. They shivered, they sweated, they prayed. Doctors wore long black cloaks and beaked masks filled with herbs, walking the streets like strange birds of death. Red crosses were painted on infected houses. Families were locked inside. The death toll rose. People avoided their neighbors. Streets emptied, churches closed. Markets fell silent. By the end of the year, the plague had taken nearly 100,000 lives, 1 in every 5 Londoners. And when winter came, cold and still, the city mourned in silence. But London did what it always had. It endured. By the following year, the plague had faded. People crept back into the streets. Markets reopened. Ships returned. Life began to stir again. The bells rang once more, hesitantly, then with strength. But then came September. And with it, fire. It began on a quiet Sunday morning, just after midnight, on the 2nd of September, 1666. A small flame flickered to life in a bakery on Pudding Lane, not far from the river. It was nothing new. Ovens burned every day in every corner of the city, but that night, something was different. The summer had been long and dry. The wind blew steadily from the east, and the timber buildings, built closely together and coated in pitch, caught fire easily, too easily. Within hours, the flames spread across rooftops and down alleyways. Sparks leapt from house to house. Thatched roofs ignited. The fire moved faster than horses, faster than bells could ring. By dawn, dozens of buildings were alight. People poured into the streets, carrying what they could, bundles of clothes, baskets of bread, cages with birds, boxes with silver. Some wept, some prayed. Some simply watched in silence as their homes disappeared behind walls of flame. The fire raged for 4 days. Churches collapsed. Shops melted into the ground. St. Paul's Cathedral, old, proud, beloved, stood surrounded by flames before its roof fell in with a terrible roar. London Bridge, long a symbol of the city, narrowly escaped complete destruction. But much of the city north of the Thames was gone. By the time the flames finally died out on the 6th of September, more than 13,000 houses had burned. 87 churches were gone. Inns, taverns, markets, libraries, all reduced to ash. Miraculously, fewer than 10 people were officially recorded as dead, but many more likely perished unseen, lost in the chaos, the smoke, the heat. Records were scarce, memories blurred. The ground smoldered for days. Ash fell like snow. The smell of smoke lingered in the clothes, in the bread, in the sky. And yet, amid the ruin, London stood. Or rather, it began to rise. Within days, the people returned. They picked through the ashes of their homes. They built tents, wooden huts, stalls from salvaged beams and cloth. Markets sprang up again, in the open air. Churches gathered congregations beneath the sky. Children played with blackened bricks. The King Charles II walked among the ruins. He spoke to bakers and boatmen. His brother James helped organize firefighting efforts, forming chains of water buckets, ordering buildings pulled down to stop the flames. The crown had seen the fire, and it responded not with retreat, but with resolve. Plans were drawn for a new London, wider, cleaner, grander. Some dreamed of straight boulevards and orderly blocks, like Paris or Rome. Rennes, Evelyn, and others proposed great visions. But Londoners were Londoners, and the city grew back more like itself. Practical, lively, crowded in new ways. The great architect Sir Christopher Wren was given a task few could imagine to help rebuild the city, including its heart, St. Paul's Cathedral. Wren's design was bold and beautiful. He envisioned a great dome rising above the skyline, a beacon of strength and faith. It would take decades to complete, but the work began, stone by stone, and the people watched it grow. Other churches, too, were rebuilt. Many of the city's 87 burned parishes rose again in Baroque forms, elegant, curved, full of light. The skyline changed, less medieval, more monumental. Steeples and domes reached skyward where once there had been crooked timber gables. The streets were widened. Brick and stone were used more often than timber. Open spaces were added to help. Slow any future fire. Fire insurance was invented. The first fire brigades were formed, not yet professional, but better prepared. Buckets were replaced by pumps. Watchmen knew what to do. Coffee houses multiplied, places for talk, trade, writing, and rumor. Men gathered to read news sheets, discuss ships, argue over politics and poetry. Women ran businesses from rebuilt stalls, handed down recipes for meat pies and gingerbread, taught their children to read. Books returned, plays returned, laughter returned, and so did the sound of music, not just in churches, but in taverns, drawing rooms, public gardens. Londoners, always fond of songs, now had a reason to sing again. By the 1670s and 80s, the city no longer smelled of smoke and ash, but of fresh mortar and roasting chestnuts. The docks were busy again, bells rang from new towers. And above it all, the dome of the new St. Paul's slowly began to take shape. People passed it on their way to market. Children pointed to the scaffolding and marveled at its height. Sailors returning up the Thames could see it rising bright against the clouds. Merchants rebuilt warehouses. Guilds reestablished their halls. Old streets gained new facades. And still, the old names remained: Bread Street, Milk Street, Cheapside. Memory held on, even when the buildings had vanished. New statues were placed. A golden ball was set atop the new cathedral. The monument was built near the site of the fire's beginning, a tall column, quietly reminding all who saw it this happened here. And yet we survived. The city was healing. But London was not just rebuilding its buildings, it was rebuilding its spirit. Through the fire, it had lost centuries of stone, wood, and memory, but it had not lost its voice, not lost its river, not lost its morning bells. Each day, the sun rose over streets still smoky, but alive with sound. Each day, someone opened a window and called to a neighbor. Someone lit a lamp and began to sew. Someone wrote a letter by candlelight. Someone walked past the charred stones of their old church and whispered a prayer to the sky above. The fire had taken much, But it had also given something back, a chance to begin again, and so London did what it always had. It endured, and then it built. By the beginning of the 18th century, London had entered a new kind of rhythm. The fires had cooled, the great dome of St. Paul's stood tall and gleaming, and the air, while still heavy with coal smoke and river mist, carried a sense of stability. This was Georgian London, a city no longer rebuilding but refining itself. Named for a succession of kings, George I, George II, George III, and eventually George IV, this era brought with it powdered wigs, symmetry, reason, and restraint. Streets that had once tangled and turned now began to straighten. Brick and stone replaced timber and plaster. New neighborhoods rose from what had been open fields and scattered orchards. Bloomsbury, Mayfair, Marylebone, each one measured, laid out in careful rows, with wide squares in their hearts and iron gates to keep the noise away. Palladian terraces faced garden parks, their doors painted in modest shades of green, black or red, with knockers polished each morning and steps swept daily. Behind them, rooms were quietly elegant, paneled walls, high ceilings, plaster, roses overhead. Fireplaces crackled, clocks ticked softly, and thick curtains dulled the sound of passing carriages. Outside, the streets grew quieter too. Cobbled, lined with lamps, patrolled by watchmen, they began to feel more orderly, more predictable. At the edge of this tidier London stood the great market of Covent Garden, still lively, still loud, but now bordered by theaters and cafes. Here, flower sellers, street fiddlers, poets, and pickpockets mingled beneath the windows of opera-goers and gentlemen's clubs. Coffee houses, once rowdy and full of radical speech, became places of polite debate. Men in waistcoats and stockings read newspapers aloud and passed around pamphlets about art, empire, or parliament. In the drawing rooms of Georgian townhouses, women wrote letters with careful handwriting, drank tea from porcelain cups, and practiced the pianoforte. Servants moved quietly from floor to floor, winding clocks, tending fires, carrying coal. Fashion followed Paris, politics followed London, and money came from overseas. For this was also the era when London's influence stretched far beyond the island. The city was now the beating heart of an empire that reached around the globe, to the West Indies, India, Africa, and North America. Ships filled the Thames, carrying tobacco, rum, tea, cotton, ivory, sugar, but not all cargo was counted in crates. Behind the goods lay the brutal machinery of colonialism, plantations, indentured labor, the transatlantic slave trade. In the stately homes of London, sugar was stirred into tea, fine cotton laid across beds, mahogany tables shone in candlelight, and few paused to ask how these things had arrived. And yet, even as the empire grew, life in London continued. In its quiet, steady way, the city was expanding outward, not upward. Tall church spires still rose above the roofs, but buildings themselves rarely climbed beyond 4 or 5 stories. Instead, London grew street by street, terrace by terrace, pushing into fields and along country lanes that were soon claimed by bricks. The first numbered house addresses appeared, so did postboxes. Gentlemen rode out to Hyde Park. Children flew kites. Chimney sweeps climbed through soot-dark flues. London was becoming a place not just to trade or to rule, but to live. The Royal Academy was founded. So was the British Museum. Pleasure gardens like Vauxhall opened their gates each. Evening, lit with lanterns, filled with music and laughter. People gathered to stroll, to dance, to eat strawberries and cream while fireworks lit the sky. At the same time, the Thames continued its quiet work. River traffic bustled. Ferrymen rowed passengers back and forth. Fishmongers set up stalls. Along the banks, bridges began to multiply. Westminster, Blackfriars, then eventually Waterloo. Each one brought new ease, new access, new patterns of movement. Georgian London was not without its hardships. The poor still lived in crowded, damp alleys behind the grand terraces, in crumbling courts where the gutters overflowed and the water ran foul. Children begged in doorways, thieves roamed the night, and prisons like Newgate swelled with souls. But the city, for all its contrasts, had grown comfortable with itself. It had weathered rebellion, seen the stirrings of reform, watched revolutions unfold across the Channel and across the Atlantic, and still it stood. The king went mad, riots broke out, political cartoons mocked Parliament and Crown, and still the bells rang. Still the shops opened. Still the fog rolled in from the river and the gaslights flickered on at dusk. It was during this time, too, that a quieter revolution took place in reading, writing, and thought. More people were literate now than ever before. Booksellers lined Paternoster Row. Novels were read in drawing rooms. Essays argued in coffee houses, poetry whispered in the corners of parks. Names like Samuel Johnson, Fanny Burney, and Jane Austen echoed across parlors and print. London had become not just a city of commerce or empire, but a city of ideas. It was not yet industrial, not fully, but the machines were humming. Canals were dug, roads improved, goods moved faster, and everywhere the past coexisted with the present. Roman walls still stood, medieval towers still cast shadows, Tudor beams still held up shop fronts where Georgian ladies bought silk and lace. Time in London was layered like fog. The Georgian era ended not with a sudden change, but with a gradual fade. By the early 1800s, steam was rising in the east. The chimneys of factories would soon outnumber the steeples of churches. Railways would slice through gardens, but for a while longer, the bells still rang. The horses still trotted through the parks. Someone still swept their front steps each morning. Someone stirred porridge over a coal fire. Someone read a letter by candlelight and smiled at the memory it carried. The city, wrapped in its brick and symmetry, moved gently forward, not racing, not roaring, but walking with poise into the next chapter of its long, layered life. By the 1830s, London was a city both familiar and utterly transformed, still held in its Georgian bones, but now humming with something new, something louder, faster, heavier. This was the beginning of the Victorian era, named for a young queen, who would sit on the throne for more than 60 years, watching her capital grow from a quiet city of bricks and books into the largest, busiest, most crowded metropolis the world had ever seen. In Queen Victoria's lifetime, London would triple in size. It would swallow villages, stretch to the hills, and fill in the green fields that had once bordered it. By the end of the 19th century, more than 6 million people lived within its reach. But in the early days, it was still a city between centuries. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobbled streets, while railway stations rose from the earth like temples of glass and iron. The old markets still buzzed, but new factories hissed and groaned in the distance. Gaslights flickered along every avenue, casting long yellow shadows against buildings blackened by soot. The Thames flowed on, but now darker, heavier, choked by the waste of industry and the press of people. In Westminster, the Houses of Parliament were rebuilt in grand Gothic style after a fire in 1834, and the great clock tower, later known as Big Ben, rose to keep the time for a city that was always hurrying. London was modernizing, but unevenly. Beneath the grand boulevards and glittering shop fronts, poverty clung tightly. In the East End, whole families lived in a single room. Children sold matches and newspapers in the streets. Chimney sweeps climbed narrow flues before they had learned to read. Beggars slept beneath arches. The gap between rich and poor widened with every passing year. Yet wealth flowed too, in endless streams of gold and tea, rubber and tin, porcelain and silk, the fruits of an empire that stretched across continents. Ships filled the docks from Bombay, Shanghai, Cape Town, Melbourne. Flags from distant ports fluttered in the damp river wind. Warehouses were stacked to their rafters. Clerks filled ledgers in dim counting houses. Bankers crossed London Bridge in tailored coats, while dockworkers hauled crates on their backs just below. Trains thundered in from every corner of the country, carrying milk, newspapers, businessmen, children, criminals, letters, and dreams. Terminals like Paddington, Waterloo, and King's Cross became cities within the city, alive with whistles, footsteps, and the hiss of steam. In Bloomsbury, the educated middle class read novels by Dickens, whose stories mirrored the streets they knew, with characters who walked through fog, fell into debt, visited prisons, wept for lost children, and dared to hope. And Kensington, the great exhibition of 1851, gathered inventions and wonders from around the world. Beneath the vast glass roof of the Crystal Palace, a building so large and light it seemed like a miracle. In Whitechapel, darker stories unfolded. In 1888, fear gripped the city as a string of brutal murders shocked Londoners to their core. The newspapers named the killer Jack the Ripper. People locked their doors, whispered in alleys, and studied every shadow with new suspicion. But even these horrors became part of the city's strange, growing myth. For Victorian London was not just a place of facts. It was also a city of fog and fiction, of mystery and myth. Sherlock Holmes solved crimes from his rooms on Baker Street. Ghosts were spotted in gaslit parks. Spiritualists held seances in drawing rooms scented with lavender and smoke. And still, daily life ticked on. The mail was delivered on time. Factory whistles blew at dawn. Horses splashed through puddles. Street lamps were lit at dusk by men with long poles. In the wealthier parts of town, nannies pushed prams through Hyde Park, while housemaids scrubbed steps and polished banisters. The buildings were taller now, terraced houses rising 3, 4, 5 stories high. Chimneys lined every roof, coughing coal smoke into the sky. People moved constantly, across bridges, into trams, down steps, into the newly dug tunnels of the world's first underground railway. In 1863, the Metropolitan Railway opened its first line, pulled by steam. Trains through smoky passages beneath the surface of the city. At first, the tunnels were hot and unpleasant, but they were faster than the traffic above, and soon other lines followed. The tube had begun, but underground wasn't the only place London was growing. New museums, galleries, and libraries opened. Their doors, the British Museum expanded. The Victoria and Albert Museum gathered beauty from every corner of the earth. The Natural History Museum told stories of ancient life in marble halls filled with dinosaur bones and crystals. Schools multiplied. So did hospitals. Philanthropists and reformers worked to improve the lives of the poor. New laws banned child labor, improved sanitation, and required schooling. Slowly, unevenly, but surely, London changed. Yet the contrasts remained. Along Regent Street, gaslights glowed on velvet and lace. In the slums, rats scurried past cracked windows. In Mayfair, people sipped champagne. In Spitalfields, they stitched shirts until their fingers bled. But above it all, the same bells rang. The same river flowed. The same fog rolled in from the Thames and wrapped the rooftops in silence. Christmas was celebrated with carols, roast goose, and crackers. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert introduced the Christmas tree, and soon candles flickered from evergreen branches in homes across the city. Traditions formed. Afternoon tea became a habit. The postal service expanded, and people began sending cards, photographs, and telegrams. The skyline thickened, not with skyscrapers, but with spires, towers, and domes. And always in every corner, someone was walking home. Someone carrying a loaf of bread. Someone returning from a shift. Someone holding a child by the hand. Someone riding by lamplight. Someone pausing by a window to watch the rain. The 19th century wore on. London continued to grow, to stretch, to breathe. Its noise became normal. Its crowd became familiar. And though the city was not always kind, it was always alive. The Victorians built bridges and rules, houses and hierarchies, trains and traditions. They laid down pipes and pages, policies and pavements. And when the century turned, quietly, beneath a soft winter sky, they left behind a city vast and full of stories. A city of soot and glass, of lace and ink, of sorrow, invention, grime, and grace. London had become not just the capital of Britain, but the symbol of a whole industrial age, one foot in the past, the other racing into the future. And still, through it all, the bells rang. By the early 20th century, London had grown so vast that it no longer ended with gates or fences or even fields. It simply blurred at the edges, bleeding into the suburbs and the hills, folding over rivers and roads, stretching as far as any map could reach. It was now the largest city in the world, home to more than 7 million people, alive with noise and movement, lit by electric lamps, patrolled by motor cars and double-decker buses, and crowned with towers both ancient and new. But for all its confidence, the city was moving toward a storm. In 1914, the world changed. War came not with the clatter of hooves or the clang of swords, but with telegrams, mobilizations, and gray uniforms. London, like the rest of the country, sent its sons to the front, to the mud and wire of the Western Front, to the trenches of France and Belgium. Posters filled the streets urging men to enlist, while women stepped into new roles as nurses, factory workers, bus conductors. The city held its breath each morning, scanning the papers for lists of the dead. Rationing began. Lights were dimmed. Air raid drills became routine, though the skies were still mostly quiet. Then, in 1917, the silence broke. For the first time in history, London was bombed from the air. German Zeppelins drifted silently through the night sky, dropping explosives onto the sleeping city below. The damage was scattered, the fear immense. People looked upward differently now, eyes not only on clouds and stars, but on the threat of fire. And when the war finally ended in 1918, bells rang, crowds cheered, and thousands gathered in Trafalgar Square to celebrate peace. But the joy was heavy with grief. Nearly 1 million British lives had been lost. London had survived, scarred, but standing. In the years that followed, the city tried to rebuild not just structures, but normalcy. The 1920s brought jazz, short skirts, new fashions, and a sense of possibility. The underground expanded, new cinemas opened. Oxford Street dazzled with lights and windows full of dreams. But the 1930s were darker. The world economy faltered. Unemployment rose. Across Europe, dictators gained power, and once again, storm clouds gathered. In 1939, the Second World War began, and this time London was ready. The government built shelters. Gas masks were distributed. Children were evacuated by the thousands to the countryside, holding suitcases and labels, waving goodbye to parents. Through train windows, and then, in 1940, the Blitz began. German bombers roared over the city night after night, dropping fire and ruin. Entire streets vanished in flame, churches burned, homes collapsed, smoke curled upward in silent spirals. And yet London endured. People slept in tube stations. Firemen climbed onto rooftops to beat back the blaze. Rescue teams dug through, rebel with bare hands. Shops opened again each morning, even when their windows had shattered in the night. Newspapers still printed, buses still ran, tea was still made. In the darkest hour, when all of Europe seemed to shudder, London did not fall. St. Paul's Cathedral, miraculously untouched, stood proud amid the smoke, a symbol of quiet defiance. During the day, people worked in offices, in factories, in kitchens and hospitals. At night, they carried blankets into shelters, sang songs, listened to the BBC by candlelight, and waited. Every morning was a victory, and every street swept clean of glass was a gesture of hope. Londoners learned to navigate a city in ruins, to find joy in small things, a blooming flower in a cracked garden, a shared cigarette, a letter from a soldier far away. They stood in queues with patience. They joked quietly in the face of fear. The fog was thicker with ash now, the air heavy with dust and memory. And yet, life went on. When the war finally ended in 1945, the celebrations were wild and tearful. Flags waved from balconies. Music rang out across the parks. Strangers hugged in the streets. But underneath the jubilation was exhaustion. London had survived, but it was bruised. Tens of thousands of buildings had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of homes damaged. The docks were wrecked. The railways strained. But slowly, tenderly, the city began to rebuild. The rubble was cleared by hand. Bricks were salvaged. Gardens were planted in the craters. Children played again in alleys that had once been dangerous. A new vision emerged, not just a return to the past, but a better future. The welfare state was born. The National Health Service opened its doors in 1948, promising care for all. Council housing was built, schools expanded, libraries reopened. The old empire was fading, but the city was becoming something new. A global city, not of dominion, but of diversity. Immigrants arrived from the Caribbean, from India and Pakistan, from all corners of the Commonwealth, bringing with them stories, songs, food, and strength. London's streets grew louder, richer, more complex. The bombs had taken brick and stone, but they had not taken soul. The city pulsed on, with new rhythms, new voices, new dreams. And through it all, the bells rang. The Thames, darker now but still moving, carried reflections of cranes and domes, council flats and cathedrals. At dusk, the city glowed, not with candlelight or gas lamps, but with the flicker of televisions, the hum of electric bulbs, the soft thump of music behind closed windows. Someone swept a doorstep. Someone set a kettle to boil. Someone, alone, in a flat, turned the radio down and let the quiet return. The city had changed forever, and yet it had not. London was still London, always rising, always mending, always carrying the weight of its past and the breath of its future in every crooked street and every glimmering window. In 2 wars, it had been shaken, bombed, tested, and scarred, and still, it had not fallen. By the 1950s and 60s, London was breathing again, not in gasps or shouts, but in something lighter, like a sigh or a song. The war was over, though its marks remained, and broken walls, and empty lots now filled with weeds and poppies, and the silent stories held behind older eyes. But a new rhythm had begun to pulse through the streets, a beat not of bombs, but of jazz. Rock and roll, transistor radios, and voices raised in laughter and protest. The city was young again, or at least it felt that way. Teenagers in bright skirts and sharp suits danced in basements in Soho, flipping records and futures at once. Red double-decker buses clattered past boutiques in Carnaby Street, where mannequins wore miniskirts and mod jackets. Music poured from record shops and smoky clubs, where bands with unfamiliar names, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who, played songs that felt like declarations. London was swinging, they said, and it was hard not to believe it. But this new London did not erase the old. It layered itself atop it, rhythm over ruin, guitar strings over cobblestones. The skyline still held its domes and towers, its soot dark brick and echoing bells, but between them came cranes. New buildings rose, not ornate or ancient, but stark and square, concrete and steel. The post-war years had ushered in rebuilding. On an enormous scale, tower blocks filled with families climbed the skies in Hackney and Lambeth. Tube lines extended deeper into the suburbs. The Victoria Line opened. New roads cut across once quiet neighborhoods where corner shops and pubs now stood in the shadows of motorways. Yet for every piece of the past that was cleared, something new tried to bloom. Parks were filled with people again. Children with ice cream, lovers with radios, pensioners with crossword puzzles. The city began to feel wider, more colorful, more awake. Television antennas sprouted from rooftops. Post-war rationing faded. Supermarkets arrived. People could buy bananas again and tinned pineapple, and sweets that hadn't been seen since the 1930s. There were still fogs, thick ones, pea supers curling around lampposts, but a great smog of 1952 had changed something. Thousands had died in just a few days, choked by coal smoke and still air, and the Clean Air Act that followed slowly cleared the skies. It would take years, but the fogs became less deadly, less frequent, and the stars began to show above London again. In the meantime, new faces joined the crowd. London became more and more a city of the world. People arrived from Jamaica on ships like the Empire Windrush, carrying hopes, songs, recipes, and quiet resilience. Others came from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Cyprus, from every place once touched by the long shadow of empire. They brought families, languages, laughter, pain. They opened shops, churches, mosques, and community halls. They found home. Sometimes they were welcomed, often they were not, but still they stayed. And slowly, they changed the city forever. Curry houses appeared beside fish and chip shops. Saris brightened the gray pavements of Southall. Reggae records spun in Brixton bedrooms. London's story was no longer told in a single voice, but in a harmony of accents, a patchwork of traditions, stitched together by streets and years in shared breath. In Westminster, politics carried on, sometimes out of step with the city it governed. In Notting Hill, a carnival began, small at first, then larger, louder, unstoppable. A celebration of Caribbean culture and survival, it pulsed through the streets each summer with drums, feathers, brass bands, and joy. And though riots would follow, and setbacks and sorrow, the music kept playing. Meanwhile, in offices and factories, a quiet revolution brewed. Women were joining the workforce in greater numbers. Children now learned in new schools, under new rules, with new books. Old certainties began to shake, about class, about race, about gender and home and who got to speak. The 1960s brought protest as well as parties. March crossed Westminster. Bridge. Students waved banners. Songs turned into anthems. And while all this stirred and surged, the city still held its quieter rituals. Milk bottles on doorsteps. Letters falling through brass slots. Dustman whistling as they worked. Dogs barking behind iron gates. Church bells on Sundays. The hiss of bus brakes in winter. A million tiny sounds that meant London was still London. The Thames, never still, carried reflections of cranes and domes, of bridges old and new. Along its banks, lovers walked hand in hand. Teenagers smoked, old men fished, and pigeons scattered at the sound of skateboards and jazz. A city of contrasts, always was, always will be. In Chelsea, fashion models and painters drank espresso. In cafes that tried to look like Paris. In East Ham, grandmothers stirred pots of lentils and ironed uniforms for school. In Camden, poets scribbled on napkins. In Peckham, shop shutters clattered open at dawn. The city was too big now to describe in any one way, too full of lives to narrow into a single portrait. And yet, there was a feeling that held it all together. Something found in the rhythm of the bus stops, the curve of a street lamp, the smell of rain on pavement. A feeling that you were somewhere layered, lived in, hard-won. Somewhere that had been broken and rebuilt more times than anyone could count. Somewhere that kept moving forward, even if it paused to look back. The old buildings still stood, the tower, the abbey, the parliament with its endless debates, but they watched over a city that no longer answered to kings, no longer waited for permission. It danced to its own beat now, sometimes graceful, sometimes stumbling, always its own. And in bedrooms across the city, radios played quietly at night, news crackled, songs faded. Children fell asleep to the sound of distant sirens and passing trains, to the hum of buses, to the calm breath of a city still at work, still at rest. In London, you could always find noise and you could always find silence. You could always find someone going home, someone turning a key, someone sweeping a shop, someone locking a gate, and always somewhere a bell would ring. By the end of the 20th century, London no longer looked just outward, across its empire or even across its rivers, but upward and inward into screens and cables, into new dimensions of sound and signal and speed. The city that once measured time by the bells of St. Paul's now ticked by the quiet hum of servers and satellite feeds. The streets remained familiar, the red buses still rumbled, the black cabs still turned their corners with practiced ease. The pigeons still gathered around the crumbs of Trafalgar Square, but something deeper had shifted. In homes across the city, personal computers flickered to life. In schools, students learned not just handwriting and history, but how to type, how to click, how to surf the invisible web growing all around them. London, once mapped by alleys and steeples, now stretched into something virtual. A city that existed not only in stone and soot, but in code, in signal, in the soft blue light of backlit screens. The skyline, too, began to change. No longer defined only by domes and spires, it welcomed steel and glass, shimmering towers that climbed above the rooftops like exclamation marks. The gherkin, the shard, the walkie-talkie, nicknames as playful as the buildings were bold. From their heights, one could see the layered city below, Roman walls beside Victorian terraces, Georgian crescents beside brutalist slabs, and between them all the parks, the pigeons, the winding river that had never left. The Thames still moved with its slow, familiar rhythm, but now it reflected LED lights, digital billboards, the flashes of 1,000 camera phones. In the underground, commuters no longer read broadsheets alone. They scrolled, they swiped, they listened to podcasts and watched videos, each journey a quiet cocoon of digital escape. And above ground, the city continued to flow, not just with bodies and buses, but with data, millions of messages coursing through invisible paths overhead. Yet in all its speed and signal, London kept hold of something older, something slower. The museums still stood, filled with echoes. The British Library expanded, holding centuries of words. Bookshops survived, their shelves heavy with paper and memory. The past was never truly past here. A Roman coin in the mud, a Tudor beam in a cellar, a wartime siren preserved in an archive. Children still learned about the Great Fire and the Blitz. Statues still stood in quiet defiance or silent controversy. And as the 21st century unfolded, new voices joined the city's song. Waves of immigration continued from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, each one adding new threads to the already rich fabric. London's food changed, its music changed, its language stretched, folded, transformed. On a single street, you might hear 10 accents, taste 10 spices, see 10 stories unfolding in shop windows and bus queues. It became a city of diaspora and dialogue, of fusion and contradiction, richer and poorer than ever, faster and lonelier, fuller and more fractured. It was a city of paradox, where luxury flats overlooked emergency shelters, where art galleries opened next to food banks, where tech firms grew beside libraries struggling to stay open. And yet, London persisted. It argued with itself, yes, in parliament, in pubs, online, but it carried on. The Olympics came in 2012, and for a moment, joy bloomed across the boroughs. Flags waved from balconies. Strangers smiled on the tube. Children watched fireworks from tower block windows and believed they were part of something big, something bright. But the years that followed were not always kind. London, like the rest of the world, felt the chill of uncertainty. Political divisions deepened. A referendum in 2016 brought the word Brexit into every household. Protests filled the streets again for climate, for justice, for voices long unheard. Then came the pandemic. In 2020, the city slowed in a way it had not done for centuries. The streets emptied, the pubs closed. The buses ran almost silently, carrying key workers through deserted roads. People clapped for nurses from balconies. They lit candles in windows. They waved at neighbors through glass. London learned again how to pause, how to wait, how to survive. And then, as always, it began to move forward. Masks came off. Trains filled again. Music played from open cafes and barbershops. New offices opened, new fears remained, but the bells still rang. The river still flowed. Somewhere, someone still swept a doorstep. Someone made tea. Someone wrote a poem, clicked send, and added, one more voice to the endless layered chorus of the city. Today, London is a city of neighborhoods and networks, of history apps and museum tours, of TikTok reels filmed beside centuries-old churches. It is a place where Shakespeare shares shelf space with the eye, where curry is as London as pie and mash, where the past sits patiently beside the future and neither seems to mind. It is loud and lonely, soft and crowded, old and new. You can still walk down a cobbled lane and hear your own footsteps, just as you can step into a driverless train and glide beneath the city like a whisper. People still fall in love on park benches, still cry in supermarkets, still daydream at bus stops, heads resting against glass, lulled by the rhythm of motion. London has not stopped dreaming. It reinvents itself without quite letting go. It forgets and remembers. It deletes and archives. It rebuilds the familiar, keeps the broken, finds beauty in what's been patched together, in tower blocks and bookshops, in protest banners and garden allotments, in late-night chips and early morning, prayer. And though the world spins faster now, though messages cross oceans in seconds and headlines change by the hour, there's still something reassuring in the morning bells of a London church, in the soft shuffle of newspaper stands, in the hush of the Thames at dawn. Somewhere, a child is taking their first steps on a London pavement. Somewhere else, an old man is sitting quietly, remembering the city as it once was. Both belong. Both carry it forward. And somewhere in between them, in the traffic, the trees, the wires, the clouds, London breathes, one more day, one more century, one more story. Mm-hmm.